Hello friends, this is another episode of the program Empire of Lies, in which we talk about manipulation and disinformation in the Russian media. Russian-style security guarantees European foreign and defense ministers are gathering in Copenhagen to discuss sanctions against Russia and post-war security guarantees for Ukraine. In yesterday's Great Game, this meeting was presented as an empty exercise, supposedly pouring from empty to empty, talking about the future without ending the war. But behind these assessments lies a much more important narrative, the assertion that Moscow should be recognized as the main guarantor of Ukrainian security. Playing with the fifth article and the illusion of protection, the idea of using the experience of NATO and its fifth article in relation to Ukraine is actively ridiculed on air. Russian commentators emphasize that neither the EU nor NATO have a real mechanism that could protect Kyiv. Moreover, there are theses that even existing European treaties, for example, Article 47 of the Lisbon Treaty, have only been applied once and have proven ineffective. The goal of this rhetoric is obvious: to instill in viewers the idea that Europe is not capable and will never dare to really defend Ukraine. It is important for the European audience to note that such statements are an attempt to demoralize, to show the uselessness of collective defense, and to deprive the EU of confidence in its own security mechanisms. The only guarantor is Russia. The key idea of the program is that the only country that can guarantee Ukraine's security is Russia. This is presented as a logical consequence. Any European guarantees will allegedly drag Ukraine into the NATO war machine, while Moscow, on the contrary, is ready to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty in a truncated form. Thus, the aggressor is trying to turn into a defender and present its own war not as the destruction of Ukrainian statehood, but as its restoration on new territories. For European readers, it is important to emphasize here, this is a classic substitution of concepts. A country that has violated international law, seized foreign lands, and destroyed cities calls itself a guarantor of security. Appeal to Western critics of the war, references to Western intellectuals are also used. Thus, the American political scientist John Mearsheimer, long known for his concept of NATO expansion provoked Russia, is mentioned as a victim of Ukrainian censorship and even as a peacemaker. His statements about the lack of infantry in the Ukrainian armed forces and the change in public opinion in Ukraine are cited as evidence of the imminent collapse of Kyiv. In the Russian narrative, any Western doubt about Ukraine's prospects turns into an argument. Even your experts admit that Kyiv is doomed. For the European audience, it is important to see Mearsheimer and others like him are becoming elements of the Russian information campaign. Their words are taken out of context and used to justify Ukraine's capitulation. But the European Union also has its own article, the 47th, which, as they say, is about some kind of European security, that countries must ensure some kind of collective interaction in case someone attacks one of the EU countries. And it was also the only one that was introduced here when France was subjected to terrorist attacks in 2015. Then they organized something there, the fight against international terrorism. But there is not even a mechanism for a real article that would ensure what this entire coalition of possibilities dreams of, that everyone would gather their armed forces and go to defend Ukraine. And they are trying to find such a mechanism so that if they stood up, nothing would happen to them. That is, their security would not be damaged. Therefore, they divide this security into parts. So they say, a neutral country that should be somewhere in some buffer zone. Then the armed forces of Ukraine. The next thing is the NATO armed forces themselves without the United States. Europe as a war machine. It is no less indicative how Russian presenters portray the EU, Brussels bureaucracy, coalition of opportunities, appendix of the war machine. Europe is presented not as a union of democracies, but as an aggressive structure that does not allow Ukraine to admit territorial losses and prevents a speedy peace. In the eyes of the Russian audience, this should justify the thesis: Ukraine could have stopped the war if not for Europe's intervention. You were on the program Empire of Lies. See you soon.